Welcome, class, to Management 4213. I hope in this very unusual time that you, your family, and your friends are all safe and healthy and continue to follow the guidelines, both from the federal, state, and local government. Hopefully, in the next few weeks, the worst of this will be past us. The purpose of this video is to help you prepare for exam number 2, which is on chapters 5, 6, 7, and 9. But before I begin with reviewing the key concepts, I'd like to take a minute and review where we are with our class. To begin with, back in March, I started preparing a series of announcements that I've posted in Blackboard under announcements that talk about the approach that we were going to be following in this class for the remainder of the semester. I've also updated the class schedule and did so both from a chronological basis as well as a basis on certain topics so that you could clearly understand what's going to be required of you for the remainder of the semester. I also decided to make changes where rather than having very detailed due dates, I've moved as much of the work as possible out into the month of May, thereby giving you the opportunity to work on the remaining assignments at your own pace. Let me take a minute and talk about those remaining assignments. So at this point, basically, there's 1/3 of your grade that is remaining. And that 1/3 consists of 4 quizzes that you'll need to do on chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13. Each quiz is worth 2.5 points for a total of 10 points for quizzes. The second assignment is to take exam number 2 on chapters 5, 6, 7, and 9. And then, if you choose to, take the final exam on chapters 10, 11, 12, and 13. I say if you choose to because if you remember, we have a total of 4 exams. 3 of the exams were chapter exams, and the 4th exam you took was the Godfather exam. Out of those 4 exams, I will drop the lowest exam grade. So the remaining exam is worth basically 13 points. And if you're satisfied with your grade from the first 3 exams, you don't have to take the final exam in May. So again, the quizzes make up 10 points of your final average. The remaining exam that you take, whether it's the exam on number 2 on chapters 5, 6, 7, and 9, or the exam on 10 through 13, or you may decide to take both of those exams and drop either exam number 1 or your Godfather exam. So you have a choice out of the 4 exams to drop your lowest exam. And then the last part of your grade is class participation, which is worth 10 points. And that class participation is basically a grade that you'll receive for doing all of your quizzes, all of your exams, submitting your videos on the key chapter concepts, or presenting those concepts if you were part of the earlier groups that presented in class. And those are the components along with doing the group peer reviews for each of the case videos. So the sum total of all that makes up your class participation grade. Again, I'm allowing, even if you miss 1 or 2 of those assignments, to still get full credit on class participation. But if you start missing more than that, there'll be some deductions on class participation. So again, those are the components that make up the remainder of your grade. At this point in time, the vast majority of the class is doing extremely well and has either an A or a B for their their final grade at this point in time. So just keep plugging away, and I'm sure everything will work out fine. So for exam number two, as I turn my attention to that, um, let me talk for a minute about what makes up the exam. There will be 25 questions. There'll be multiple choice questions. Each question will be worth 4 points each. And the questions will come essentially from the key concepts in chapters 5, 6, 7, and 9. Those key concepts will make up about 90% of the questions for exam number two. Now, I think the best way for you to prepare for exam number two is to start by quickly skimming through those four chapters in your textbook 5, 6, 7, and 9. You don't have to necessarily study them, each of those concepts in depth, but just make sure you're familiar with the chapters. The second step would be to go through the key concepts. For those of you that might not remember, the key concepts are contained in the content section of Blackboard. You'll see what appears to be anywhere from 3 or 4 up to maybe 6 key concepts for each chapter, and that's going to make up the majority of exam number two. The third step would be to review the group videos that are in discussion board that talks you through their PowerPoints on the key concepts for chapters 5, 6, 7, and 9. And finally, review my video, this one here, because I'll add additional emphasis on those key concepts that are most important and those concepts that you just might happen to find questions on exam number two. So the way I'm going to approach this is to go through the key concepts chapter by chapter. And what I would suggest is you watch the group video of, let's say, chapter 5. Then you can open up this video that I've prepared and review the key concepts that I'm talking about for chapter 5. Then pause my video and go back to the group video on chapter 6. Watch that. Again, those videos are in discussion board. Then go back to this video and listen to my comments on the key chapter concepts for chapter 6. The same thing for chapter 7, and then finally for chapter 9. All right, so let's begin. In chapter 5, there are 3 key concepts that I'd like to talk about. The first is called resource dependence. Resource dependence is when one organization, makes a decision to rely on another organization for a key resource. Those resources are part of really what becomes that organization's supply chain, for example, if they're manufacturing items, or can provide very strategic information to the success of that corporation. When you have a resource dependence philosophy, the organization with the resources is given influence and power over the organization that needs the resources. Probably the best example we can see today with the coronavirus is the dependence that the United States has, probably most of us were unaware of, with the amount of medical supplies and medicines that are made in China. So as coronavirus spread in the United States, I'm sure you've heard of countless stories about shortages on personal protection equipment, on face masks, on testing equipment, on swabs, on ventilators. The vast majority of that equipment is manufactured in China. And it's easy today to go back and say, well, how could we have allowed that to happen? Or how could we have allowed it to happen that for many of our antibiotics, some talk about over 90% of them are manufactured in China? How could we have put such a critical resource all in the hands of a single country. But I promise you, over many, many years, as those decisions were made, um, the thinking was utilizing another country primarily because of its lower cost of labor or manufacturing to help drive profitability for companies. So that's resource dependence theory. The second key concept I like to talk about is collaborative networks. And this is similar, but instead of resource, it's organizations allowing themselves to become dependent upon other organizations to increase their value and their profitability. And again, this is similar to resource dependence, but in the case of a collaborative network, we're talking about organizations in its entirety to become dependent upon other organizations rather than resource dependence talks about a particular resource that you would require to receive from another company. So that's the second key concept in chapter 5. And the third key concept in chapter 5 that I'd like to talk about is the concept of population ecology, which can easily be described um, in its most basic form as survival of the fittest. So, survival of the fittest is when primarily um, in economic terms, um, the more financially fit a company is, the more successful it'll become in today's changing business environment. We've talked over the semester about the challenges with retail shopping and Amazon and how over the past 5, 6, 7 years, every holiday season, a greater and greater percentage of goods are purchased online through Amazon. And as a result, the pressure that that has placed on retail stores. And in today's environment, and as I speak to you today, we're in a position here in San Antonio where all of the retail stores are shut down. Um, the restaurants are shut down with the exception of takeout orders. Um, but organizations like Amazon or delivery organizations like Favor that delivers groceries for HEB are thriving. So the question I would pose to you that you should think about is whether this change that we're experiencing now with the coronavirus will actually speed up this trend to move more and more to an online network. Um, and the pressure that that's going to place on retail stores, on shopping malls. There could be very significant changes made in our economy as a result of this change. Another example of this change in terms of resource dependence is the concept of working from home. So, in many estimates today, over half of the population that is in fact working, that hasn't lost their job, um, are working from home. Many people are getting a good taste of the advantages and some of the disadvantages of working from home. And they're getting that over a long period of time, over a month or 2 months. So the question becomes as we come out of this crisis, um, will this result in even a greater push to allow employees flexibility to accomplish their tasks in a work from home environment? I think I mentioned to you earlier in the semester this concept that I heard about in Austin um, for job descriptions and job types that's called digital nomads. Digital nomad is a person who can work for a company anywhere in the world, essentially, and just plug in online into meetings or group chats or whatever the facility is that the company has um, to engage, but really having very infrequent, if ever, face to face conversations with individuals. Again, the question would be if there is more of a trend to that, What does that do to the commercial space? What does that do to all the large office buildings that you see throughout San Antonio? What happens if that demand dries up as employees demand more flexibility and more free time that comes with um, working from home in that kind of environment? Not to mention the safety issues that'll still be out there until we get a vaccine for the virus. So really, that is the three key concepts in chapter 5. So once again, it's resource dependence, it's the collaborative kind of networking, and it's population ecology, survival of the fittest. In chapter 6, we talk about alliances for global expansion. And there's three types that we talk about. There's licensing, when a company enters um, a new area of the world, typically in developing countries, businesses will limit their risk by licensing their names to foreign partners. So, an example of that might be Saks Fifth Avenue licensing its name to stores in the Middle East or in Mexico. The second alliance is called a joint venture, and really there that is a separate legal entity created with two or more active firms as sponsors. So the difference between licensing is in a licensing arrangement, a business limits its risk by licensing their name to a foreign partner, whereas a joint venture, it's a separate legal entity created with two or more firms as sponsors. The third example of an alliance is something that's called consortia. And consortia is a group of independent companies. They could be suppliers or customers or competitors that join together to share similar skills, resources, costs, and access to one another's markets. So those three concepts are very important in chapter 6. In addition, in chapter 6, there are organization charts that you should be familiar with that describes different stages of international expansion for an organization. And what you need to do is be familiar enough with an organizational structure so you can be able to tell if I put an organizational structure on the exam, whether it's in the pure domestic stage, whether it's in the international stage, whether it's in the multinational stage, or whether it's in the global stage. And a quick review, the domestic stage, based upon an organization chart, you won't see any reference to a global kind of expansion or focus. In the international stage, that's really the first time that an organization is starting to get its feet wet with international business. And that usually shows itself in an organization chart in an export or import department, for example. But it's at a department level. Okay, it's not at a division level, but at a department level. The third stage would be a multinational, and where an international stage might be with one company, a multinational, just as the name implies, would be with multiple nations that you're doing business with. And finally, the global stage is where a company is so intertwined throughout the world that based upon the organization chart, you can tell, for example, where its home base was. You couldn't tell what country was a company's home base. And again, there are organization charts in chapter 6 that talk about those four stages. You need to be familiar enough with that to be able to identify that and pick out the appropriate stage. The next section is chapter 7. And in chapter 7, we talk about different type of departmental technologies. And there are four of them. There is a craft technology. There is a routine technology. there's a non-routine technology, and then there's an engineering technology. There's actually a chart that's contained in chapter 7 that describes that. And you should be familiar with those four technologies and how they relate. And so if I posed a question describing a certain type of job that, let's say, was repetitive and didn't require a high skill level, I would expect that you would know that that is a routine type of job. If I said that there was a job that was non-routine and required a high level of analyzability, that would be something like strategic planning, for example, or applied research. You should be able to identify that as a non-routine job. So become familiar with the four pieces of departmental technologies and how to distinguish one from the other. In Chapter 7, it's also important, and there's likely to be questions on the exam about what the authors of our text refer to the three interdependence. And there's three types. The first one is called pooled interdependence. The second is called sequential interdependence. And then the third is called reciprocal interdependence. And I like to use a sports analogy in describing that. A pooled interdependence is the lowest form of interdependence. And it's simply the majority of the tasks are performed by individuals. And so oftentimes I would ask the class between baseball, football, and basketball, which of those three sports would be considered pooled interdependence, meaning which sport has the most individualized actions, requires the least amount of teamwork. And that, of course, would be baseball. A sequential interdependence is when there's a team that has to rely on each other in predictable ways for the flow and for the success of the team. So, for example, out of the three sports, baseball, football, and basketball, football would come closest to sequential interdependence. It's a serial form of interdependence. The center hikes the ball to the quarterback. The quarterback would either hand the ball off to the running back or drop back and throw a pass. But there's certain sequences, but they have to go in order for the team to function successfully. And then the final interdependence is a reciprocal interdependence. That sport would be basketball. And here, the difference between sequential interdependence and reciprocal interdependence is in reciprocal, the team members perform similar tasks working back and forth. And what do I mean by back and forth? So if you're a player on the Spurs team, for example, you're going to play both offense and defense. Okay, you're expected to play both offense and defense. Whereas in football, there's basically one team that plays offense, and then when that team ends up punting the ball and goes on defense, the offense usually, or the majority of the offense, will at least run off the field, and then a different team comes on for the defense. So it's that sequencing between offense and defense that makes it a difference between football when there's two separate teams. And in basketball, it's reciprocal. The same individual is expected to perform both functions of offense and defense. And then the final concept in Chapter 7 is to understand the difference between service technologies and manufacturing technologies. And I'm sure the vast majority of you feel very comfortable with this concept. But there is a chart in there that explains the characteristics of a service technology versus a manufacturing technology. Probably the simplest way to explain it is that a service technology does not make something physical, right? They're not manufacturing a product. Their value to the company is in the relationship that they're building with the company's customers. So be familiar with those attributes that describe a service technology versus those that describe a manufacturing technology so that you can tell the difference between the two. And those are the concepts in Chapter 7. So, again, just to review Chapter seven's key concepts, it's departmental technologies, which there are four: craft, um, non routine, routine, and engineering. There are three interdependence theories, which is pooled, sequential, and reciprocal. And then there's understanding the difference between a product and a service. And finally, the last chapter is a chapter that talks about why organizations decline. There's a chart in the book that talks about three main causes of organizational declines, which is organizational atrophy, when organizations become old and become inefficient or overly uh, bureaucratized. They basically lose their ability to be nimble and to change, possibly because they have too much of a capital investment. Once again, think about all of these commercial leasing companies that have millions and millions of dollars tied up in commercial space, that it's expecting that space to be rented out by companies with employees that are basically driving into work. And if that environment changes, if many of the employees start working from home wherever possible, if that's considered actually part of the benefit package to an employee, the fact companies won't need anywhere near as much office space. Well, what does that leasing company um, do, or that developer who built the building and has to still pay off all the loans on it? Being stuck with a brick and mortar structure uh, really limits that organization's ability to be flexible, and therefore can easily cause that organization to go into decline. The second cause is vulnerability if the environment changes. And again, this is very, um, um, this is clearly what we're facing today with the coronavirus. The environment's changing. People are moving away from close working environments, and we'll see um, when the crisis lifts if people are going to be comfortable in going back to their regular um, type of workplace. We'll see, especially like in call centers where people are sitting within, you know, 1 or 2 feet of each other, um, working. If we will ever go back to that environment, we'll see if in airplanes um, will the airlines continue to fill those middle seats so that people are, in a cabin for hours upon hours at a time, literally within a foot um, of a different passenger on either side of them. And then the final cause of organizational declines would be environmental declines or competition. So if companies are quicker, are more nimble, um, for example, would encourage work at home environments rather than face to face, that could be viewed as a major benefit where some of the top employees will find that more attractive. And that's going to place financial pressure on those companies that are going to see a higher issue of attrition. The second area of key concepts in Chapter 9 are the 4 stages of a life cycle. Those 4 stages are the entrepreneurial stage, where organizations are first born and created. Think of Steve Jobs working in his garage, um, along with Wozniak building their first computer. The second stage is called the collectivity stage, where organizations develop clear goals and directions. The third stage is a formalization stage, where you then, for the first time, see rules and processes and procedures to control people and structures built in. And the fourth stage is the elaboration stage, where you start developing a new sense of collaboration and teamwork with an organization that is much larger in order to be able to deal with those issues. So be familiar with the four stages of an organization's life cycle. And if I give you a brief paragraph that describes an organization, I would expect that you'd be able to tell what stage of their life cycle that they're in. And then the final key concept that I want to talk about is clan control. This is a use of social characteristics such as shared values, commitment, and traditions, um, and beliefs to help control organization behavior. The example I would give in class was during my experience at Rackspace, um, especially when it was a very young company. They had very few policies, very few procedures. Um, Most folks did not have job descriptions. There weren't key processing indicators or metrics that you had to hit. So you would say to yourself, well, then how did the organization thrive in an environment like that? Well, it was the team itself that became the clan that controlled the environment. So, for example, if you showed up from work um, more than 15 minutes late, um, maybe once a week um, or once every other week, there wouldn't be a firm rule that says, you know what, you're allowed two latenesses, and then the third time you'll be written up, and then the fourth time you'll be put on a final warning, and then if there's one more occurrence, you're going to be fired or let go. That didn't exist in Rackspace. It was up to the team to control their environment. Just like it's up to each of your groups when you're working on a group project to control your environment. And it's the groups within our class that set the ground rules. Um, no two groups' set of rules are the same. And it's the same way that it worked in Rackspace. It was the team or the clan that controlled the environment. And so it didn't require a lot of rules and policies and procedures, but it put the burden on the team itself. And if someone was truly abusing a certain situation, it would be the team that would call that individual out. And then if that person didn't change and adapt to the team, then a member of the team would probably go to HR to report the issue with the team's recommendation that they didn't want that particular employee any longer. So that's the basically that's the key concepts in chapter 9. Once again, to review the key concepts in chapter 9, it's reasons why an organization declines, which is atrophy, which is vulnerability, and competition. Um, there's the stages of an organization's life cycle: the entrepreneurial stage, the collectivity stage, the formalization stage, and the elaboration stage, and finally, clan control. So study these concepts. Again, watch the videos that groups 5, 6, 7, and 9 submitted in the discussion board forum. Um, and after you watch each group's video, let's say on chapter 5, watch my video here that describes the key concepts in chapter 5, and then go on to the group 6 that does chapter 6, and then continue with my video that's describing the key concepts in chapter 6. Again, good luck. I wish everybody the best, and hope everybody stays safe and healthy. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at milano.ken@gmail.com. Um, Keep in mind, please, that the assignments are open-ended in terms of the due dates. It's giving you the opportunity to work on the remaining quizzes, exam number 2 and an exam number 3, um, as well. If you also happen to be in groups 10, 11, 12, or 13, and that'll help you um, as long as you do the work and don't wait for the last minute. Thank you. Good luck. Stay safe.